Right, so what we're going to look at now is some diets which have been shown to have a positive influence on inhibiting the pace of dementia and maybe have a positive effect on people with memory. And these are the only diet studies. There's been a lot of studies on different nutrients, which may be positive, may not be positive. But actually diet, where the diet is having an influence on preventing dementia or a lack of certain foods in creating it, this is the first positive result. And I got these from Jeff Brand's Functional Medicine Update when he had a series of 4 talks by different neurologists. And the last one, Morris combined the Mediterranean diet, which, as you know, tends to be the fish, the oily fish, the salads, the olive oil, etc., with the prevention of hypertension diet, the diet against hypertension diet. And this combination they called the MIND diet and consists of 10 factors. The most important, first one, was 4 to 5 leafy green vegetables per day, which is not that easy when you think about it. You have to put in your kale. We'd allow sort of cabbage, spinach, broccoli, etc. But 4 to 5 is quite a hefty dose. You can, of course, juice these up, but 4 to 5 is still a fair bit to actually get in. And perhaps one of the major factors of that is related to folic acid. And that I can remember back, a professor, they did a television documentary some years ago on this, that this professor at Oxford University was convinced that Alzheimer's was due to a folic acid deficiency. And he wanted to introduce folic acid into bread and things like that. And he got ridiculed and couldn't get any of his work published in any of the medical journals because they were all affected by the pharmaceutical industry, and there was no patent on folic acid because it's a food supplement. And in the end, he left Oxford University and went to work in Edinburgh doing a totally different subject. But he was convinced folic acid was the core, or lack of folic acid was the cause of it. But a few weeks ago on television, there was a program about reliving time in the Victorian times with Anne Widdecombe and other people in there. And one of the things they were talking about was the amount of vegetables and fruit that people in Victorian times ate, which was a lot more than what the average person does in this country. And what was interesting is that we probably wouldn't eat these because they're bitter. And in the last 100 to 150 years ago, since then, most of our food has become much sweeter. Then what they've done is not by genetic engineering but by natural selection, is they've taken where there's the bitter taste, and we know that the tongue picks up bitter, sour, salt and sweet. They've removed things which have the bitter taste in there. But the bitter taste are certain substances called polyphenolics, which are antioxidants but also protective substances for the plant against predators. So things don't eat the plant because they taste bitter. But because we no longer have those and the leaf tastes much less bitter, let's say, and sometimes in some cases it's even sweet, they're eaten by pests. So this is now we've got the problem that we've got the pests coming in because we selected the better taste for us, which actually had the poorer nutrients. So those polyphenolic substances aren't so great in our modern vegetables as they were 100, 150 years ago. So what was interesting in that particular program was that the average calorie intake in Victorian times was 5,000 calories. And yet obesity was a relatively unknown issue because people were all working manually. They were like athletes. Only an athlete could eat 5,000 calories, but they were working continually and eating a lot of fruit and a lot of vegetables. But as far as the dementia, the MIND diet, the green leafy vegetables tend to be the ones which are slightly bitter, and are often the ones which are sort of, we tend to go for the whiter bits of the cabbage rather than the green and so on. But the green bits are the important bits. Now, the second one was the orange and red fruits and vegetables. Orange and red fruits tend to be carotenoids, and they tend to absorb everything from turquoise round to blue and violet. So the complementary colours to the blue, violet and turquoise colours would be the red and the yellow and the orange here. So we're looking at ones which are rich in carotenoids. So carotenoids are antioxidants, as we know. They're protective substances because of that, and they have this complementary effect against the blue wavelengths. Now, berries came up number 3, and by that it would be your blackberries, your blueberries, of course, or myrtles, etc., black currants. These were much richer in anthocyanidins, which protect on the blue side against the red end of the spectrum, red-orange. So the blue absorbs that. So these are much more the anthocyanidins, which are particularly rich in the back of the eyes, in things like blueberries or bilberries. Nuts. Very good, especially if they're not roasted, unfortunately, because the oils will have gone rancid there, and we must be very careful about rancid oils with brain problems. But nuts, and especially good, were almonds and walnuts. Walnuts are interesting, aren't they, because they look like a little brain on either side. So they're sort of nature's way of saying this is a brain food. So nuts, almonds and walnuts. Beans and pulses were very good. So these, although we have to watch that we don't have too much of them, Jill will talk a bit later this afternoon, because a lot of the amino acids are actually rich in beans and pulses, and as long as you can digest them, they're fine. But a lot of people blow up with a lot of wind, so they've got to choose which ones to have. So beans and pulses were considered sort of poor man's meat 50 years ago, but are now being to realise that they're very good sources of certain specific amino acids. So you see they weren't very keen on fruit. Fruit didn't come up high, but berries amongst the fruit was the highest, and some red fruit. But generally, the average sort of fruits weren't mentioned in this to have protective effects against dementia. So remember, berries are good, and red fruit. Olive oil was obviously part of the Mediterranean diet. We found that the better combination for northern European people, in other words where we are, is organic cold-pressed rapeseed oil with pumpkin seed. Now, pumpkin seed is an oil which is rich in delta-4 desaturase enzyme, which helps us to convert the alpha-linolenic acid, the omega-3s, into DHA. And DHA is the richest fatty acid in the brain. So having enough DHA is really, really important for our brains as we get older, because if we don't have the right omega-3 oils in the brain, then we will tend to deteriorate, particularly if we've got oxidative damage occurring. But for southern European people, because rapeseed is a more northern European, southern people get on better with olive oil, but provided they mix it with pumpkin seed. So our one of rapeseed and pumpkin seed we call Smart Thinking oil, but sometimes people will respond better to olive, not on its own, but olive with pumpkin, if they're from the southern Mediterranean area. So if you've got somebody from Italy or southern France, they may well show and strengthen to olive and pumpkin rather than the rapeseed. But for us, rapeseed is a better one with pumpkin, provided it's organic and cold pressed. Fish, excellent, of course, oily fish is the better of those. But beware for blue people, of fish, although the fish would be all right, but it's the fish oil where it's concentrated in, may be an issue with mercury for blue people. But eating fish several times a week is probably fine. It's impossible to get really clean fish these days because, of course, everywhere gets polluted by the same source. So even if you have farmed salmon, it can be fed organic food, but it's still fed by the sea as far as if there's any pollution in there. Skinless chicken, I would draw a slight contention there. Chicken would be fine normally if it's free range and organic, but remember it's a white meat and therefore contains virtually no B12. So it's really, really important with people who are getting dementia that they get enough B12, because B12 matures the red cells which carry the oxygen around. And in fact, it has a very important role. It's not just maturing the red cells, it's actually the foundation material for making heme. And heme goes on not only to make hemoglobin, but all our cytochromes in our mitochondria. So lack of B12 is probably more of a problem with dementia than anything else. And that could be just hydroxycobalamin, or it could be the activated forms if the people have got polymorphisms, like adenosylcobalamin and methylcobalamin. Whole grains, definitely good evidence that people eat whole grains keep their minds and their body better. The only thing we've got to watch there is in case of somebody who's got a gluten sensitivity, true gluten sensitivity, We've worked and told for years, we've taught that whole grains don't tend to do this, particularly whole organic wheats. Tends to be tolerated by most people, providing you mill it fresh and make the bread fresh. And so far we haven't found anybody who's weakened to a homemade loaf of bread when it's actually made from organic whole grain. But if you mill that flour and then buy that flour commercially in a shop, it can be months and it can even be years old, because it has a sell-by date, but not when it's milled. And so the whole grain will have the bran in there and the wheat germ, and the wheat germ oil will have gone rancid, and so you're actually taking in rancid oils. So the easiest way now is to just make your own. If you do a bit of baking, this is what I teach people to do, and buy a NutriBullet, and you get 2 containers with the NutriBullet. You get one for liquids and you get one for dry compounds, and they're relatively cheap these days off Amazon. And you can do grains, whole grains in there, just 15 seconds, and you've got enough for a loaf of bread, dead cheap. We're, at the moment, experimenting with Kamut wheat, which is one of the old wheats from Egypt, from the pyramids. The story goes that service guy was stationed out there from America in the early 1950s when they opened one of the tombs up, and they found these pots of the wheat, and just for research, because he was of farming origin, tried to see whether the wheat would actually grow, and found it would grow after 4,000 years. And it had a unique shape to it, and when they analysed it, it was phenomenal as far as the protein content. It was only had half the number of chromosomes of modern wheat, so it was very much easier digested by people who are gluten sensitive. But most important, as we'll see a bit later on, is it's the richest source of selenium. So Alexander the Great, who conquered half the world before the time of Jesus, fed his troops on Egyptian wheat, and that's all. They didn't have anything else, and they marched to Persia and back again on Egyptian wheat. Now later on today we're going to give you some, if you want it. We're going to give you some Kamut bread, which you'll find is made from organic Kamut wheat, and after you've eaten that you won't want to eat any other bread. Okay? But as a special treat, in addition to that, which we'll tell you the reason why a bit later on, is you're going to have some unpasteurized butter. So you're going to have Kamut wheat, organic Kamut wheat bread, and unpasteurized butter for a particular reason. And you'll say, ooh, yes. So whole grains, if you are truly sensitive to gluten, in other words, see that case, you may need to look at other grains which are non-gluten, like rice. So you do need the whole grain, because if you avoid grains altogether, you avoid most of your sources of vitamin Bs. So you need the Bs, the B1, B2, B3, which are all rich in whole grains. And the chances are that unless you eat a lot of liver and offal, you won't get those vitamin Bs effectively from any other food source. So you do need your whole grains. And number 10 is red wine. Resveratrol, which is the antioxidant in there, and other polyphenolics, are particularly richer in red wine. They are in white wine to a less extent. And what they've found is that probably people who drink alcohol, even if it's spirits, again have a lower instance of dementia. Okay, now they don't know why this is. They think it's the antioxidants, but they think it's also that most people don't drink on their own. They drink with other people. And when you're with other people, you socialize and you're thinking and stimulating your mind. So that's a very good reason for going down the pub, isn't it? Okay. So the good news is the red wine, possibly any alcohol will do this. The bad news is for women it's only 1 glass. For men it's 2 glasses, but they don't say how big the glass is. So that's the... So those are the 10 major points that they found show very, very well to preventing. And it's the only dietary study that's actually been done, called the MIND diet. So if we just refresh ourselves on that, leafy green vegetables, number 1. So try and get those in as far as the prevention is concerned. Orange to red fruits for the carotenoids, berries for the anthocyanins, nuts for their oils and protein, beans and pulses again for specific amino acids and fiber, olive oil, rapeseed with pumpkin to help stimulate the DHA, oily fish because of the DHA and the protein, the chicken. I think the red meat has a a pro-inflammatory side to it. That some red meats, particularly with if they're high in arachidonic acid, may stimulate in some people prostaglandins 2 series and leukotrienes. So the tendency towards the whiter meats was favoured. But as I say, you've got to be very careful because it may not have any B12. Although a lot of people in old people's homes tend to eat chicken more than beef or lamb is the best source of B12 or wild meat. Whole grains, certainly look into Kamut, maybe even to einkorn. At the moment, we cannot find any einkorn grain, whole grain. You get flour, einkorn flour from Does Farm, but you can't get it as a whole grain yet. But it may be available, and that's the simplest. That's why it's einkorn. It was the very first type of wheat, which has the simplest chromosome pattern. So it's easiest to digest. And red wine and possibly anything else. So that's what we've added from last time. So that sort of summarized it, but also put into some context about things that you can do to prevent and also to work. We've learned that exercise, turmeric are very, very good, and generally to follow that Mediterranean type of diet. That doesn't mean that people in the Mediterranean don't get dementia. Okay, but that type of diet seems to favor less inflammation. And inflammation is the key destructive action that occurs in the body that leads to degeneration. And the question is, how do we get inflammation which leads towards this destruction? And the answer is you can get inflammation when inflammation shows. You can get it from foods that we eat. So true allergic reactions generate allergies. We can get it from infections. We can get it from toxins. So when we go through phase 1 detoxification, we produce superoxide in the process. So toxins there. We can get it from the wrong oils. So we have an increase in the bad oils, trans fats, etc., and not enough of the omega-3 and omega-6 oils. So we stimulate prostaglandins 2 and leukotrienes. But there's a common medium to all those inflammatory reactions. And that common medium is the production of reactive oxygen species, which comes first. So the production of reactive oxygen species then leads towards the cascade of cells producing histamine and kinin and prostaglandins and so on, the pro-inflammatory chemicals. So where do these reactive oxygen species come from? And generally the answer is that they come from inside the mitochondria. And the major reason that we produce reactive oxygen species inside the mitochondria is actually a lack of oxygen, which is hypoxia. So actually a low level of oxygen generates free radical production in the mitochondria itself. Now, when we've done the little oximeters there, you very rarely find anybody's below 97, maybe 96, when you stick the oximeters on the nail bed there. We've never yet found anybody of 100%. So in other words, every single person in this room doesn't have 100% oxygenation. So that's fine, fair enough. But on the other hand, they're not dying. You know, according to the chart, you've got to get down to below 90, maybe even 80, to really be gasping for breath. But some of our patients are pretty bad, and they show hypoxia or lack of oxygen, but they're coming in at 96, 97, which doesn't make sense. So when we find somebody actually is hypoxic and they respond to the eye position and they strengthen to O2, we're looking at the inside of the mitochondria, inside the cell. Okay, we're not looking at what's going in the mouth. Are they breathing properly? We may be looking at the transport of oxygen in the heme, for sure, but we may also be looking at the other end of the oxygen getting actually into the furnace where it's being used. So when a person shows to hypoxia, when we're testing, think of it where oxygen is used, not just the transport of getting it there. Okay? So it's actually in the mitochondria, and it's in the mitochondria, the powerhouse itself, where all these electrons are flying around, which become detached and attached to oxygen molecules in a condition of low hypoxia. So hypoxia is probably the most important reason for people getting brain degeneration and setting up inflammation. So we may be lacking energy through the actual Krebs cycle, mitochondrial transport. We may have damage to the mitochondria itself because of reactive oxygen species. We may have lack of oxygen. We may require more antioxidants or protectors to absorb or quench these free radicals being produced. We may be full of chemicals inside the mitochondria and metals, in which case we need to detoxify. And we may just not have the right nutrients to make acetylcholine, which we learnt was the major neurotransmitter for the memory recall. So that's what we came to the conclusion, that the cause of memory loss and dementia was lack of energy, mitochondrial damage, hypoxia, need for more antioxidants, need to detoxify, and need to make acetylcholine. So those 6 factors are what we put together. And what we've done is we put just some general nutrients that you might want to consider. Now, nothing is hard and fast ever. We know that the marker for energy production would be magnesium ATP. So if a person strengthens to magnesium ATP, they're short of energy. So you might consider all the Bs. So sometimes we find a B complex shows up rather than the individual Bs. Now, sometimes the whole has a greater effect than the parts. And so you don't actually find the person muscle test needing B1, B2, B3, B5, B6, and so on, but they do to a B complex. So there's a reason sometimes that the B complex, because once you start to get one B, you may need some of the other ones. Okay? So, but not always. You know, to me, if a person is B6 deficient, they've got a big pothole with lack of B6, then you fill them up with B6. And then you give a B complex or a multiple over the top, if you like, once they're okay. But in order to fill the pothole up, you've got to supply the individual B. But if a person doesn't show to any B and they're tired, try a B complex, put on the B complex marker, and sometimes you'll find B complex will strengthen them amazingly and fulfill all the criteria, but the individual Bs won't. So think about B complex. Magnesium, of course, always. Magnesium, 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 magnesium. Every single pathway in glycolysis and in the Krebs cycle, and a little bit in the electron transport requires magnesium. So when people say, what should I take if I'm going out to do sport or competition, and you can't really work it out at all, just B complex and magnesium is enough. Okay, that's pretty certain you're going to get most of the things that a person needs. So B complex, magnesium. Alpha-lipoic acid. Alpha-lipoic acid helps to convert pyruvic acid into acetyl-CoA. So it gets the food compound, if you like, the substrate, across the mitochondrial membranes. It is an antioxidant, and it's like the king antioxidant because it has a controlling influence on all the other antioxidants. So it's very, very important, and it's so important, it's water-soluble and fat-soluble. So it crosses cell membranes, but it also crosses cell cytoplasm. So it's water-soluble and fat-soluble. So it's a very, very important one. So it works heavily in the mitochondria as well. Smart thinking oil for the DHA, which is the fatty acid rich in the mitochondrial membranes. And as we'll see, the whole thing that spins the Krebs cycle, in other words, the speed of our metabolism, is thyroid hormones. So thyroid hormones are what actually control the metabolic rate, as we all know. But the metabolic rate is the speed of the turning of the Krebs cycle. So if you crank that Krebs cycle up fast, you produce more energy. If you go slowly, then you produce less energy. And you remember in the first part what I said, 80% of energy goes to heat in the body, 80%. So when you crank it slowly round, you don't get the metabolic rate, and therefore you get cold because your temperature drops. The only reliable way of knowing your metabolic rate is your body temperature. Okay. You can go on all these machines, but if the physiology machines for respiratory metabolic rate, but you mustn't move in there, because if you move the slightest bit, you alter your metabolism. So the best thing is when you wake up in the morning, stick the thermometer under the arm and just read what your temperature is. And if it's below 37 degrees, then you know you've got a slow metabolic rate. And the thing that turns the Krebs cycle are the thyroid hormones, but mainly T3. So T3 is the biologically active, 10 times more biologically active than T4. And what we found is the majority of people have enough T4. They produce the T4 in the thyroid gland with a little bit of T3, but it's the conversion of the T4 into the T3 which is the critical thing that occurs in the liver and in the mitochondria locally. And to do that, you need an enzyme called deiodinase, which is an enzyme that takes one iodine from T4 to make T3. So 4 minus 1 equals 3. And that occurs locally in the mitochondria and the liver. And that enzyme is selenium dependent. Now, we all know that, or most of us know that. And how often do you find selenium shows? Virtually never. Okay? Occasionally selenium will show, but you think of the number of people who have this hypothyroid or low level of T3 is amazing. I would almost guarantee half the people in the room have low levels of T3 conversion, but you very rarely ever find selenium. Okay? And there's one simple way for this, as we'll see. And I found this by accident looking up something else in Harper's Biochemistry. And Harper's Biochemistry describes exactly how the body uses selenium, which is something I've been searching, or the latest edition describes it, of precisely what selenium it uses. And you'll be surprised, because the only form that it uses is selenium phosphate. And it makes the phosphate from ATP. So adenosine triphosphate is the phosphate donor for selenium. And when those two come together with H2O, which is a liquid, which is water, it makes selenium phosphate. And that's what it uses to incorporate into the amino acids to make the enzymes. Okay, and only that. So if you don't produce enough ATP, you're caught in a cycle because you're not producing the ATP to activate the selenium to go on to make the enzyme to change T4 to T3. So you get caught. Okay, so you're tired and you can't get out of this vicious cycle. So your body temperature is low, you're tired, etc. So we want to look at selenium phosphate, how it actually works and how to make it. So T4 to T3, energy production. Okay, now let's assume we've got damage to the mitochondria. What damages the mitochondria is free radicals, oxidative damage from free radicals. We need DNA polymerase, which is the enzyme inside the mitochondria, inside the DNA of the mitochondria itself. And all DNA polymerase enzymes are zinc dependent. So you need zinc to stimulate repair. We know that zinc, the main thing with zinc deficiency is repair of tissue. So somebody who's not repairing tissue at a sufficient rate, very slow to repair, think zinc, zinc, zinc and zinc. CoQ10, as we'll see, is the carrier from complex 1 to 2 to complex 3. So this is a carrier substance for the electrons. Turmeric has a role here as an antioxidant, but also as a protector at complex 4. Vitamin B12, in order to supply oxygen to the tissue to get the oxygen level up, which will stop the free radicals. Folates and B6. Now those three things all work together, as we know, to help metabolize homocysteine. And homocysteine is something which potentially can cause problems, cardiovascular problems. So whenever you give B12 in any of its forms, always check folates. Or if you ever need to prescribe folates, check B12 because they go together in the neurological system, and check P5P or B6. So always check for those three together because they work together, particularly in things like homocysteine. Vitamin C, antioxidant, again, helps all tissue repair and regeneration. Thinking oil, because you want to put out the good oils rather than the old oxidized oils and rancid ones. And there has a real role here on the saturated side for coconut oil. Coconut oil, organic coconut oil, is very good. It's full of mid-chain fatty acids, which are good on the saturated side because they keep the cell membranes where you need a saturated oil. They keep it flexible in the cell membranes there. But don't cook with it. Don't cook with it. It's 10% unsaturated. It's a really interesting test, this. Organic cold-pressed coconut is great. Put it on as a spread, no problems at all. It strengthens, does a lot of good. It's really recommended for people with dementia sort of problems and can produce. As soon as you cook it, it weakens. Just muscle test it and see it. Very interesting. Yeah, it's the unsaturated part. It's 10% unsaturated. And that goes rancid very quickly. And that's what stinks the house out. So when you use coconut oil for cooking, you know it goes everywhere. It permeates all your clothes everywhere there. And that's the unsaturated part of it. It's gone rancid. It's a really interesting experiment. I tried to do it for a long time, and then I've just recently done it. And it will muscle test, jump, jump, jump. But cold-pressed, cold, excellent. Like all oils, if they're cold-pressed. But as soon as you heat them, they start going rancid, and eventually they'll become a trans fat. So regenerating the mitochondria, we'll look here a little later on about vitamin D. Vitamin D has a profound effect on all tissues. Practically every tissue in the body has now been found to have vitamin D receptors, hundreds of different tissues. But the question is which vitamin D works. And there's a third active form of vitamin D discovered. And there's very little it's all journal material at the moment, but there's one which will just revolutionize you as far as you find adapts to the hormones and the regulation of the body. One form of vitamin D, which is not the normal types of vitamin D that we're familiar. In other words, it's not the 125 or the 2425, as we'll see. So I want to introduce you to that and what foodstuffs that's in, naturally. And the alpha-lipoic acid acetylcarnitine mix of Bruce aims for helping get the mitochondria regenerated. Alpha-lipoic acid, remember, is the universal antioxidant, and it helps us to burn fat. Acetylcarnitine, the carnitine part, acts as the transporter of getting fatty acids or triglycerides into the mitochondria to burn. So what Bruce Ames says, as you get older, you basically don't burn fat. You tend to burn glucose and you burn protein. So when your blood glucose level goes down, you switch into gluconeogenesis and you start to burn protein. And the major protein that you'll burn is your muscles. And that's dangerous because once you've lost your muscle tissue, sarcopenia it's called, you can't restore it. Okay? So the thing that to try and restore this, it's very difficult or impossible, but to prevent it, there's a thing called branched chain amino acids, which Jill's going to talk about this afternoon. And it's very, very important that you supply the right branched chain amino acids to the person because they compete. So Jill's subject this afternoon. So alpha-lipoic acid acetylcarnitine, this is the fat burner. This is the thing that helps us to burn fatty acids. So hypoxia, lack of oxygen, you might want to think about smart thinking on the DHA, in other words, get the person to get the oxygen across the cell membranes. Glycine and 5-methyltetrahydrofolate, these are the starting blocks to making heme. So heme is the ubiquitous substance that goes on to make hemoglobin, but also makes all our cytochromes in the mitochondria. So to do this, we need glycine, we need adenosylcobalamin, that's the active form, one of the coenzymes of B12, 5-methyltetrahydrofolate, magnesium, zinc, biotin has a role here, methylene tetrahydrofolate, so we've got two types of folate there, and tetrahydrobioptin. Now, overwhelmingly, when we have a hypoxic heme problem, overwhelmingly it's a B6 deficiency. And in most people's cases, it's pyridoxal 5-phosphate and not just B6. In other words, they've got a polymorphism, which means they can't activate pyridoxine into pyridoxal 5-phosphate. And then they get the problems of the buildup of these intermediate substances in making heme called porphyrins. And when you get high levels of porphyrins, you become sensitive to the light, which is what I'll talk about this afternoon. So people who are sensitive to light at 400 nanometers create oxidative damage in the back of their eyes. So you always remember porphyrin conditions with King George III. Remember I taught you that before, when King George III was kept in Windsor Castle, and when he was kept in Windsor Castle he made rational decisions, but he was a farmer, he loved his farm, he went outside, and once he was in the light out there he made really crazy decisions and went mad, as they call it. Watch the film The Madness of King George, which depicts, probably a bit of poetic license with the story, but basically when he was outside he was quite insane for a period of time in his life. When he was indoors he made rational decisions, and that's porphyria. That means a build-up of these porphyrin compounds while you're making heme. That's quite interesting because it's a genetic problem of converting one porphyrin into another, and we know that these are often pyridoxal 5-phosphate issues, but not B6. So giving B6 doesn't solve the problem with most people. They have to have pyridoxal 5-phosphate, the activated form. Vitamin C is important in the production of heme, and iron, which is the molecule in the middle of heme, which carries the actual oxygen around. Antioxidant support, in other words, there to act as the blotting paper for the free radicals. Undoubtedly, inside the cell, which is what the mitochondria is, the number one is reduced glutathione. So this is the number one antioxidant that we should all be testing for, much more, is reduced glutathione. It's the principal thing. Later on, we'll see that glutathione has a role in other functions in the body. There's 3 roles of glutathione, but reduced glutathione as an antioxidant is the number one antioxidant. And to oxidize it, it requires an enzyme, and then it's reduced again. So it's recycled. So an antioxidant basically will accept the free radical, become oxidized, and then becomes reduced by usually by NADPH again. But the thing in this particular case of the glutathione peroxidase enzyme is a selenium-dependent enzyme. So this is the second most important function of selenium. We've already talked about the deiodinase one, but the second one is the glutathione peroxidase. So to recycle glutathione is we don't have to keep making more and more glutathione. We need the selenium to stimulate the recycling. Turmeric, very, very powerful antioxidant. The turmerones and the curcumirones are very powerful antioxidants in there. So again, good plus point for turmeric. But other spices will do this as well. There's a lot of interest with Alzheimer's and dementia with cinnamon, and also with cloves. Not quite as pleasant as, but taken in the capsule and put into food, very, very good. But again, our quality and our advantage is we can muscle test to see which is the most effective one for our patients. Vitamin E. Research which I learned from the Functional Medicine Update is that vitamin E in high doses, which is 2,000 IU per day, which is a high dose, along with the Aricept, or the medication that inhibits acetylcholinesterase, had an effect of reducing the rate of dementia. It didn't reverse it, but it had a profound effect on reducing it when they took 2,000 milligrams of vitamin E and the Aricept, or the equivalent drug, on there. When that was a better effect than the drug itself, which actually proved that the drug was basically useless. So there's two forms of drug for it, neither of which seem to be effective really at all. But they did a later study using natural vitamin E of a much lower dose from food. And the thing was, the natural source of vitamin E is a fat-soluble vitamin, so it's in oils. And the oils which are the highest in vitamin E, as we've known, is wheat germ oil, providing it's fresh, cold-pressed organic wheat germ oil. Pistachio nut oil is fantastic as a source of it, and sesame. Sesame contains sesanoids which help protect the vitamin E itself and help limit the breakdown of the vitamin E. So those three oils we call smart vitamin E. They're a natural source of vitamin E. So they're not like alpha tocopherol, which you get. Natural oils have the gamma tocopherols, which are equally, and the tocotrienols, which are protective antioxidants, not just alpha tocopherol. So this is the first approach. Using it with the drug wasn't like an antioxidant effect, like a pharmaceutical effect. But this one actually had a more profound effect. So test with the vitamin E, the smart vitamin E. Lutein, particularly for the eyes. Lutein is a yellow compound. It's a carotenoid, rich particularly in the rods in the back of the eye. Very nice. And the biggest source of lutein is kale. Kale looks green, doesn't it? But if you're like me and you put the kale in the fridge at the end of the week, it's yellow. And that's the lutein if you haven't used it up. Okay. It was very interesting because there's a program on, was it Channel 4, called Dispatches during the week. I don't know whether you watched that, but I just happened to switch it on, and it was saying that I'm going to talk about kale and its beneficial effect to people with eye problems with macular degeneration. And it was really quite interesting, that, but they didn't actually state it was lutein in there, but we knew it was lutein. And I thought, well, this is good. The programs are coming really more our way now with nutrition. And then they were talking about the xylitol, and there's a sweetener, and stevia, natural sweeteners. And at the end of the session, the woman said, and of course there's all this hype about aspartame, and it's now been proved to be totally harmless. And there's no problem at all with using aspartame. And I thought, ooh, I'm not sure about this program now. Who's paying for that information? So lutein, ginkgo biloba, well-known tree, of course, for antioxidant properties and a vasodilator to improve cerebral flow in the brain. Worthwhile, if you've got a garden, worthwhile planting it. It's the leaf which is the important part, which has the ginkgoloids in there. Interestingly, in the east, where they're grown, it has a nut, and the nut is on the end of the leaf. It's quite unique. The nut is not part of the flower, it's actually on the end of the leaf. And it's the nuts that they use in Japan, which they say is the valuable part and not the leaf. We use the leaf as a herbal tincture. But if you grow it, all you've got to do is remember where you put it in the garden, because you're putting it in for 20 years' time. So you're hoping you're going to stop the dementia by putting the tree in, so you've just got to remember where you put the tree in. And you've got to have a big enough one. And apparently you must put a female tree in, because the males stink, apparently. There is a male tree, but you must only put the female in. Okay, lemon balm. Lemon balm has got a good track record, both in capsules and tincture, for helping people with dementia. Old people's homes have found this as a lemon balm tea is very good. Apparently it's much more effective, lemon balm, if it's taken with a nip of vodka. Okay, because the vodka dissolves the active ingredients in the lemon balm and then they absorb it better. Or to use the tincture, the alcoholic tincture, is more effective than just the capsule on its own. Rosemary, simile, and green tea. So they're both full of antioxidants. Okay, detoxification. Now we come back to glutathione again, but for a different reason here, because glutathione itself is a phase 2 conjugator, rather like sulfur, rather like acetyl groups, with glucuronic acid, etc. Glutathione itself is a detoxifier. So it needs vitamin C to make it, alpha-lipoic acid, selenium to help recycle, as we said, and N-acetylcysteine can help here to, again, the cysteine part of this goes on to make glutathione, along with glycine and glutamic acid. So detoxification, smart turmeric. Most spices and herbs will detoxify. It's one of the properties of them, but you've got to find which it is for you. So smart turmeric is pretty universal. Coriander is a wonderful detoxifier. This is the spice. The herb will do, particularly for metals, but determine it's the same plant, but one is from the seed and one is from the green shoots. The coriander is a wonderful detoxifier, particularly the spice. Yarrow, again, we use that pretty much as standard as a chemical detoxifier with people. Lemon balm, black walnut tincture, our favourite for treating, along with for parasites and things, and probiotics to help get the gut microflora better to stop the toxins. And then lastly in these, as far as the nutrients, acetylcholine synthesis. So the acetyl transferase enzyme here needs magnesium. We could use B complex here because in this process you need B1, B2, B3, B5. But certainly the major one is B1, which is thiamine. So to make acetylcholine, we need thiamine. So we need to make acetyl from the conversion of pyruvic acid to acetyl-CoA in the mitochondria here. And acetylcholine goes on to make the neurotransmitter to make our neuromuscular junctions work and our brain work. But that acetyl also goes on to acetylation, which helps us to detoxify certain chemicals. So acetylcholine is very important. So B1 here, choline, of course, to link with the acetyl group, manganese, smart zinc in there, and we could use AcetylCarnitine here to supply the acetyl group if someone isn't making enough of this from the mitochondria. So somebody who's low in acetylcholine, these are the nutrients that you might consider. So remember, you picked that up probably off gallbladder 1 here, that they would be low. Do you remember the 3 ways that we tested? We got you to think about the first day at university. You went weak, and then we did a triple warmer for the excitatory neurotransmitters, conception vessel for dopamine, gallbladder for memory recall. And most people, it was the memory recall, which showed that they were low in acetylcholine. That's the Bruce Ains formula that I talked about, acetylcarnitine, which helps us to burn the fat, to the carnitine shuffle to burn triglycerides, with the alpha-lipoic acid, which itself is a coenzyme, but it's the most powerful of all antioxidants because it regulates all the other antioxidants. Okay, so that's having a look at the reasons why people develop inflammation in their mitochondria, which leads to neuronal death. Remember, neurons have up to 5,000 mitochondria. Most cells in the body have 1 or 2. Muscles have several thousand because they have to work so hard. But neurons have up to 5,000 mitochondria. That means the neuron makes more energy than any other tissue in the body. Therefore, it needs more oxygen. And the brain uses 25% of the oxygen of the body, 25%. So it actually makes 25% of the energy used in the body is in the brain. So the brain is the first place that you see when energy starts to go down. So memory involves clicking neurons together and making connections. So the memory losing the memory, indicates your energy production is going down. So unless we address the problem with the energy and build that up through those factors that we've just looked at, you can't expect to recede and change the dementia or the memory loss that's going on. So to enhance it, these are the programs that we would suggest. So look at those 7 different factors.